Hello, welcome to today's webinar. We are with the Why Zoos and Aquarium Matter project. We're talking about aligning your agendas with those of your visitors. Thanks for joining us. My name is Melissa Ballard. I'm the Communication and Community Manager at the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education. So we are funded by the National Science Foundation, and we support the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program, as well as the broader informal STEM education community. One of our biggest efforts is informalscience.org. Hopefully you have been there and found resources on it. To date, we've got over 8,000 descriptions of research products, evaluation reports, and other things that come out of interesting projects like today's webinar, folks. We also have some specific things for zoos and aquaria. If you go to the menu and look at develop projects, under Learn from Experience, there are some dedicated pages to citizen science, zoos, aquaria, and public libraries. And on each of those, you can find specific examples of funded projects, key resources, evaluation reports, and some professional associations. The last thing I wanted to flag for you guys is our year in ISE. In case you missed that last month, that contains about 160 resources across all of the informal STEM education sectors. So, of course, zoos and aquarium, but also citizen science, youth and after school, libraries, media, etc. So make sure to check that out. And if you have anything that comes up in 2019, please let us know. We are always looking for meta-analysis and sort of really important reports and events in the field. I'll just start with our disclaimer. So we are funded by NSF, and any of the things that case staff say or our presenters say, of course, are their own personal views, as well as the research findings presented, and are not necessarily those of the National Science Foundation. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters and let them introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'll get started. My name's John Fraser, and I'm with New Knowledge Organization based in our office in New York City.
And I'm Joe Heimlich. I'm with the Center for Research and Evaluation at COSI.
My name is Martin Storksteg. I'm at OSU, Oregon State University's Center for Research on Lifelong STEM Learning.
So that's us, and you don't have to look at us much longer. We're going to turn off our cameras. And Joe, over to you to introduce us to the project goals.
I think that was actually me who's taking over. Hi everybody, this is Martin again. In terms of goals of the project, broadly speaking, so we're not going into details here, there's very specific things that we're pursuing, but at the end of the day, there's three overarching goals. One is to understand how the visitors' interest in coming to a zoo and aquarium or their goals for their visits, and then the subsequent or related behavior, if there is related behavior, while they're at the institution, is impacting what they take away from this institution, particularly in light of what they might learn very broadly speaking, not just cognition, but also affect and other kinds of things. So it's this kind of connection between what's my agenda, why am I coming, what am I doing as a result of that, and what do I take away from it? And particularly in light of the conservation education agenda that most zoos and aquariums, all zoos and aquariums have. But here it's particularly this idea, how does this overlap with the visitor agenda? And here's an interesting example, just a simple way of thinking about this, which is right now we could potentially imagine that the visitor agenda and the zoo agenda, let's say the zoo agenda is in green, the visitor agenda is in blue, has very little overlap potentially. And the goal would be through our research and subsequent conversation with practitioners and how to translate that into experiences that visitors at zoos and aquariums might have, how this overlaps more, like the next thing would basically show that. In other words, we get a nicer marriage between what zoos and aquariums want to accomplish and what the visitors want to accomplish. And what's important here is, in the previous slide, was the notion that we're not just doing this from the visitor perspective, but also from the way in which zoos and aquariums are discussed in society. It's a broader perspective that not only the people here, what is the role of zoos and aquariums in society in general? How do they speak about it? But also how this then translates. And so at the end of the day, our project is asking the question, what are these outcomes of zoos and aquariums more broadly speaking? When we say the zoo and aquarium enterprise, we're not just asking what does a visit do to an individual or to a group that goes there, but also more broadly, how does this influence the goals that zoos and aquariums overall have, And then, so it's not just the visitor as the destination, but then also how zoos and aquariums are being seen in the public media. When we say that means in public discussion, what role is being assigned to them. So with that, next one. We are 3 organizations that are doing this, 3 research organizations with different strength in coming to this research. New Knowledge, then COSI Center for Evaluation and Research, and Research and Evaluation, and Oregon State University, our center, bring very different perspectives to this, and we'll talk about this in a moment. But what's really important here is that the Association of Zoos and Aquariums is a partner here, and the idea here is that the research that we are conducting gets directly translated. There's a designated client of a group of people who will already then quickly know what to do with the results of this, irrespective of publications and so on and so forth. With that, I hand over to, I think, Joe.
Nope, it's actually me.
Oh, it's you. Here we go.
And that's okay. We're going to be doing this is our collaboration, so we tend to talk about the same topic, and we're always not sure who's on next because we're all working on the same thing. So the 3 teams are each thinking about the story of how is learning happening as an integrated setting. So we've often talked about learning in zoos and aquariums or in any cultural institution as something that is the result of an individual visit. We think about what happens when someone comes, when they go, what is the learning they take away? But what we know from that experience is that it is not just the visit itself, but rather there's a context around the visit. What is happening? What is the institution putting forward? What does the group want to get from that? What have they heard about that experience, or how are they shaping that experience in context? But we add a 3rd layer to it, which is the social, the societal discourses, the conversations that type an institution. And here I take you back to the 1990s when the Smithsonian Institution started to recognize that their individual museum settings were each perceived to fulfill different needs and different desires, and that kind of shaped the entry narrative and also what people thought about when they read about those in the news. So this project attempts to take one question and look at it across the 3 different domains to look at the interaction effect we see between the individual visit, the context, and the societal or social narratives that shape the role of the institution. So that brings us to Joe.
Finally, it's Joe. This study is unique in the learning world in that it is exploring the entire visit cycle. Building on those nested concepts of individual context and society, we're examining the visitor and the visit to a zoo or aquarium. We really are wanting to know the beliefs and ascriptions of the larger society and then the context of the visit, along with what happens to the person during and through the visit itself. We view this through 5 stages related to the visit. What are the values and perceptions of zoos and aquariums assigned by people as a societal whole? Then we want to break apart the individual and find out who they are at the occasion of the visit. Who is the visitor? Where are they in life stage, career, personal stage, interests, and a host of things that make them each unique to the person visiting. Then we explore what they intend to do and do during a visit to the zoo or aquarium. And importantly, for the aquariums, zoos, and the NSF, what do they take away from the visit? What do they gain from this individual singular visit? And finally, we want to know how they feel about how this one visit affects their larger view of zoos and aquariums and their role in society. At the core, what people do during a visit and what they take from the visit regarding conservation messages espoused by various zoos and aquariums, much of the work is being done by OSU, with triangulating data from CRE and comparative data with NKO. Some of the innovations of the work being done by OSU include use of GoPros to try to track through visits, and they're conducting an experimental study looking at what prompts people to talk about what they're seeing when looking at a zoo or aquarium exhibit. We are also looking at what people bring to the visit in terms of the knowledge, motivation, interests, background, experiences, and the like, and then explore those. And again, we're trying conservation messages espoused by the various zoos and aquariums. This work is being done by the Center for Research and Evaluation and is intentionally interwoven with NKO's work on the front end and OSU's work on the visit and outcome side. Some of the innovations here include developing extremely rigorous demographic measures, testing them, and asking things in different ways to try to learn more about who people are and incorporating life stage and career stage along with the other demographics. And finally, NKO is doing their work in the larger societal context, exploring both the overarching societal views of aquariums and zoos, and then the challenging questions related to how does a person integrate outcomes from a visit and apply that against the larger societies and their own perceptions of the role of zoos and aquariums in society. Many of the innovations with NKO are integrations of some very interesting theories, especially out of psychology and social psychology, and using them to look at national samples against which we can compare the other studies being done. And I'm going to turn it over now to Johnny.
So that lays out the research that we're pursuing, and we thought it would be smart because it is such an integrated, layered project that we might start to ask using the chat box any questions people might have about how we're thinking about this integrated experience, from the visit itself, what people bring, do, and take, to how they integrate it in their life, and then assign or even develop social stereotypes about what a cultural institution can do. So if you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring them. And you can do this throughout the webinar as well. So if you do have questions after we spend this minute or two exploring people's first questions, feel free to put them in the question box. And if they come up in the discussion, we'll try and address them as we go or come back to them later. So I'm just wondering, does anybody have any thoughts about how we're framing this cycle, this learning cycle, and what happens?
Joe, we did have a request from one of our attendees, if you could remind us what the acronyms stand for, and maybe try to use the full name of your partners going forward.
Sure.
For in the model that we were showing you, this is John Fraser, and I am from NKO is the letters, or New Knowledge Organization. CRE stands for the Center for Research and Evaluation at COSI, and OSU, Oregon State University Center for Lifelong Learning. Now, the other one that people who are from outside the zoo world may not recognize, but is very familiar to the zoo world, is WZAM. This is the Why Zoos and Aquariums Matter studies. They've been going on since pretty much continuously since 2001 on behalf of the field. And this is our third wave looking at the concept of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and how that fits inside the social stereotypes, the experience, the activities people engage in when they're visiting zoos and aquariums. I think that's it for acronyms right now, other than AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums.
Great, and we do have another question from our audience,
Sure.
and they ask if this model applies to museums as well, and what might be some of the similarities and differences.
I think we're going to demonstrate as we move forward that this project does have direct implication not only to other museums, but museums, nature centers, public parks, botanic gardens. The model is set up so that we're really thinking about what is the social cycle of informal learning that occurs not just in a visit, but through a visit, from a visit, to a visit, the whole experience of what is the legitimacy of the institution in its society, and how does that shape what they do, what they bring, what they do, and what they take away. So the model is what we thought was such an important thing to focus most of this webinar on, talking about this model of looking at an evaluation or a research model that covers the whole spectrum of where learning occurs beyond the visit as well as in the visit.
And I want to give one example where for natural history museums and science museums generally who featured evolution, there was a study done a while back where we looked at the degree to which controversy that is discussed in society resonates within, let's say, the Natural History Museum when they feature it. And it turned out what was important here is to distinguish between how these things are discussed in general and what role people assign to a natural history museum, for instance, where it is acceptable then and not a problem to feature evolution. because people expect it to be there. They have no problem with it being featured there. And they will engage even if they at times do not engage with it in the way we want. So that's, for instance, one example where a very similar kind of approach was helpful in understanding the way in which visitor agendas and bigger political discussions are interlaced with the way in which a visit to a zoo, a visit to a natural history museum might be perceived.
And actually, it's good foreshadowing, because the next half of this webinar, we're going to be focusing on some of our results, exploring what is the learning ecology and how do people apply social stereotypes to types of learning they expect from different museum types. So we're going to get into that in more detail in a minute or two. So I'm just wondering, are there any more questions before we move on?
We didn't have any other questions, just a request for taking another look at the graphic. We're going to put in the chat box the link to the WZAM project's entry on informalscience.org, which links to some of their project posters they presented recently, as well as their URL to their website, where they've got a blog that lays that out.
Thanks, Melissa. So you can see in front of you now, we went back to the diagram just to talk about those simple languages. We recognize that bring, do, take, and integrate and assign are different levels of public school, high school learning in terms of their word recognition, but we felt they captured the ideas that the bringing, the doing, and the taking. The color coding kind of lets you know where the different organizations are working as well. We know that it's a blended issue, but generally the societal perspective is new knowledge. The bring and the take experience is the Center for Research and Evaluation, and then looking at that individual perspective is where OSU's work is happening. So with that, we're going to move on to present some results to you. This is really the societal dimension that we've already got emerging data, and so we're presenting something that is currently in review right now at a couple journals, but it's the results of our attempt to describe the learning ecology. Effectively, how are people perceiving zoos and aquariums in their larger social world, or where are they learning? So I'm taking you to the top of our diagram to talk about how people are thinking about the role of the institution in society, what its affordances are, what I can expect to gain from that institution if I was to go, but also how I think about it in the media, when I'm looking at resources online, when I hear in the news that something has happened. These are all parts of the way society builds discourse around the subject or the concept. We know that a zoo and aquarium is not like your neighborhood milk shop. It's something that you think about within a system, within a larger system, and is definitely something people refer to when they talk about their communities. So our research question was, how does the public perceive the zoo and aquarium within a STEM learning ecology? What is that range of institutions, and what are the different things that I would select going to zoo and aquarium over another thing? So we're looking at this, comparing STEM learning through a variety of perspectives, because people know that STEM can be learned in a variety of places. In fact, we started by doing qualitative studies with focus groups to ask people, where do you go to learn about science, technology, engineering, or math? And we made sure that we kept them separate so that people would tell us where they were going. And we started to hear that they were listing their cultural institutions along with places like restaurants and other domains. We were also asking them, what would you be getting? What kind of topics would you expect to see at a zoo or an aquarium? And when you think about science, technology, engineering, and math, and they came up with ideas that were not necessarily top of mind, but were quite logical once we got through it. They started to talk about things like understanding water quality, complexity in construction. How do you actually house an animal is seen as a very complex, fully integrated STEM discipline, as well as topics as grand as climate change or animal care. We also asked how they were learning, and we started to hear that they came up with a variety of topics that, not surprisingly, are these learning modes that show up in the literature. So that really didn't surprise us. So we set out to describe. So now we know all of these categories. We asked people to rate them and rank them by type to see how they coalesced. And using cluster analysis, we developed a map of what would be a STEM learning ecology. And these things grouped. So stores and financial institutions have a lot in common. Auto shops, libraries have a lot in common with planetariums, but not as much as planetariums have with athletic facilities and parks. We thought that was kind of fun. Zoos and aquariums uniquely group with backyards and front yards, whereas natural history museums, botanic gardens, and state parks seem to group together. And not surprisingly, science centers are the definitive STEM unit. So anybody who's on the phone, on the webinar here from a science center, I know you're doing like a high five. I think we were a little bit more surprised to see the overlap we found with the backyard, front yard, and zoos and aquariums rather than an overlap with the Natural History Museum. But that's sort of a cluster analysis to give you a sense of how people are organizing the kinds of STEM. The next thing we did was went out to ask, what's the frequency? And in this case, we're, again, using a national survey and breaking it down so that people are answering either by science, technology, engineering, or math, so that they are targeted toward a response, so that we can understand how you would describe the institutions. And in the next illustration, what we're looking at here is a heat map. It shows the degree of intensity that people believe they are experiencing this kind of learning, and we group it by the categories of math, engineering, technology, and science. Now, we know that the Science Center, for example, on our left-hand side is seen as the classic STEM learning where you get across the spectrum, but clearly there's a higher emphasis toward engineering. The zoo and aquarium, on the other hand, is not perceived to be as often or as frequent a contributor across the whole spectrum, but more likely overlaps science and engineering, with the aquarium showing a little bit more technology than the zoo. And you can compare this to the Botanic Garden, the Natural History Museum, so you can get a sense that people are seeing STEM, just not at the same frequencies. So then we wanted to understand, so how do these STEM topics set zoos and aquariums apart or distinct? So this is the social stereotype of what would I expect to see or not expect to see at different types. So again, going to a heat map, you can see where the frequencies are. And there's, I mean, I know it can look a little muddy at first, but there is some real distinction around what the social stereotype is going to be. Unexpected to do animal observations at botanic gardens, though last time I was at one, birds and butterflies are pretty common. But again, the equivalence we see between the backyard animal observations and animal observations people are seeing at an aquarium, we found quite interesting. The use of the senses, again, not a surprise. We're also not surprised that nobody reads any signs in their backyards, although there's a lot of keep off the grass we just sprayed. So, you know, it is kind of interesting how these things suggest that there are distinct types and that the type will influence how people are going to anticipate, expect, or need to overcome an expectation if there's a desire to use more of an approach. So learning facts, for example, is something that, you know, is definitely more aquarium than zoo. I thought that was a kind of interesting variation. Natural history museums are very fact-based and presentation-based, whereas that's not really part of the social stereotype at the same level as zoos and aquariums. We were also very heartened to see the amount that conversation is part of the learning experience, because that's seen as pretty much anything that's in the sector. So that's a heat map. That kind of explains where we've been able to look at what are social stereotypes for zoos and aquariums. And with that, I'm actually halfway through our presentation, but we've covered some of the content we wanted to present today because we thought that we would take you to a set of questions and really try to respond to some of your thoughts about how this approach is shifting your thinking about what we can do in understanding the learning experience. So we had
a couple clarification questions just about your methodology for this piece of work that I'll pose to you real quick. So someone was curious about how did you come up, settings like restaurants, like how did that get into the mix? Is that something that you guys decided on, or did that come from the folks?
That came as a result of focus groups we did across the country. So we did focus groups, and then we did some pilot surveying of the general population to say, where do you encounter? And wanted to get the natural response. So we did, within the focus groups, we used a Post-it note exercise where people were working in teams of 2 in a fairly large room, and they were writing on Post-it notes how many places they were learning about science, how many kinds of places, how many could they come up with. We did them in a zoo or an aquarium so that we could then go further and talk about the zoo or aquarium. But first it was how many other places do something like this. And then as a group, in our focus group, we asked them as a group to code the data and analyze it with us, and to group the sets so that we could winnow down to categories. So if somebody put, the Billy Bob market, for example, we were in one community where a very well-known market came up. We had to talk it through to describe what it was, because it was a kind of somewhere between a flea market and a farmer's market and a fair, and there were rides, and you could buy used clothing and crafts and go and watch a movie. And so it was an example of having to describe that kind of thing. But through that, we came up with categories and sets of things, which is why Auto Body Shop also showed up when we started talking about STEM. So Auto Body Shop and restaurant and grocery store were considered big STEM learning environments. I think we were more surprised once our national survey, the 1,500 people that we surveyed, came back, how closely they were integrating those commercial businesses with the cultural institutions as common learning experiences.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting and surprising reaction. We had a couple of comments from the audience in that respect as well. And then another question for you about that process. Those focus groups, are those people you grabbed just for visitors at zoos and aquariums, or how did you get those people?
Well, actually, the focus groups, we recruited members. So we worked with zoos and aquariums across the country. We sent out our teams to different venues, but we tried to stratify by political voting patterns, the urban, rural, zoo, aquarium, and we tried to get a good representation across the regions. So that's how and then working with their membership offices. Zoos and aquariums have really long membership lists, and so we tried to get, again, a purposefully stratified sample. So we were getting 1 or 2 people representing different classes of folks based on how they've categorized them in their community. The reason we wanted to go to members is we felt that they would have the deepest affinity for the zoo and aquarium, but would also be able to think about their larger community, so we could get into nuance about where you see learning. In that case, we weren't trying to get a representative answer, but we were trying to broadly define the concourse of how many different ways can people who know a zoo or aquarium also describe an analogous learning experience outside the zoo or the aquarium, so that we could compare them in further studies. So this was really data gathering.
And great. And we just have 2 more questions about that piece, and then we'll shift to kind of a panel where all of our presenters will come up and we can ask them some bigger questions.
Sure, happy to talk about this study forever, though. Go ahead, Melissa.
For the focus groups, how did you define STEM learning? You dig in a little bit to those definitions.
Actually, we let the groups workshop with us the answer, but effectively we said, we didn't say STEM. We've consistently on this part of the work talked about science, technology, engineering, and math as if they are separate domains. And all of our surveys have taken people down that channel. So we've tried to not define it as an aggregate, but define it by its subject heading. And while I don't have a slide here, we have about 40 different terms that aggregate to science, and then similarly we do the same for engineering, and they're kind of disciplinary learning. So we code those kind of responses so that, for example, when we think about things like climate, that would land in a different category. When we think about things like construction, architecture, that ends up in engineering. So we code the words against science, technology, engineering, and math, but we start by aiming them toward the single word. So it becomes a focal word. In fact, that's why we see such variation. So if I can just slide back up to the slide that shows you the categories of STEM, those are aggregate categories. So we're going to get there for you. So in that case, even though we're saying Science Center, all of the studies channeled the respondents down the math channel, or another respondent was channeled down through engineering. So we weren't asking them to bounce back and forth between them.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I know we have a couple more study questions, but let's shift gears a little bit. And this is a question for all of you if you guys want to come back on your video. So someone was curious, kind of when we started doing the project framing, how do you decide what a significant societal conversation related to zoos and aquariums is? So there was kind of this we're thinking about what are big STEM issues that folks want to tackle. If we're thinking about trusted institutions just in local communities, do you have some examples just with doing this research about maybe, I guess, socioscientific issues or controversial science issues that you think zoos and aquaria are well positioned to address or engage folks in?
Yeah, so that's a very layered question. Part of it is you're in the integrate and assign category, which I'm going to try to answer a bit, but I'm going to start by saying that it's not like this project birthed itself. It is part of this continuous wave of research that's been going on since 2001. And the folks that are on this webinar right now, we've been involved that long. Sorry about that, but that's how long we've been at this business.
We're old.
But some of the earlier research coincides with some market research that suggests there's a diminishing favorability in zoos and aquariums. Now that's somewhat controversial research because it's how you ask the question. And so part of the story of assign and integrate is that zoos find themselves often talking about favorability or how much are they trusted resources, especially because they have a conservation agenda. And so to activate conservation action in society, they are going to need to be seen as a trusted voice. So they are very specifically talking about conservation biology, trying to use conservation, develop a conservation-minded society. And we recognize that conservation is not science. Conservation is moral priority setting. And that science itself is a way that we can know the world. It's a process for developing knowledge. But in fact, many of the decisions we make invoke the technology, engineering, and the math. And of course, science and math are so integrated that it really came down to, because they have a flavor, they have a specific mission, and they have a focus. It's important for us to step back and look at this concept of trust and authority, because if you want to participate in the learning dialogue with anyone, you first have to have the authority to even have something to say or share, or else people just shut you down. Joe, maybe you can talk. I'll let both of you talk because you've got some different ways of looking at where your work led to this place.
And one element of that is that in all three of our organizations, we are doing a lot of overlap intentionally so that we can compare and make connections. So New Knowledge has been looking at national panels. And so we're going to be looking at it at the individual level, asking some of those same things or parallel things so we can get find out how does it resonate in different ways. And so we've designed our studies to be integrated in that kind of a manner. And it's a bit overwhelming when you look at how much data we're all getting.
And we're coming to this from a very different perspective in that we don't make any assumptions. We simply send people off with their happy GoPro cameras and record in a very comprehensive way what they actually do, how they speak, what conversations they have, how they respond. And here the idea is that we don't make any assumptions. We just want to find out, where are the conversations people have? How do they pick up ideas during their visit without any pre-assumptions about this is where it happens? Does it happen while they're standing in an exhibit that has clear interpretation about socio-scientific issues? Or does it happen 20 minutes later when they are eating during the cafeteria visit or something like that? So it's here for us, it's important to be very observational and very open-minded in where this happens, so we can feed into the zoo and aquarium, and frankly into other informal science education institutions, a bit more of a sense of the comprehensive nature of the visit and how it is connected to how they come in, how they leave, and when they come in, what Johnny and Keo are doing, what do they bring from a broader societal discussion to this whole conversation? What are they taking into this broader societal discussion? So in that sense, we are fairly open in terms of what this will look like.
There's one thing I want to throw in while we're waiting for the next question, because I'm sure there are some. One of the interesting things that's happening right now is that we're doing studies in some unique ways. Martin is doing an experimental study. The OSU is doing an experimental study in the zoos and aquariums. That's pretty cool in terms of shifting to try to explore how dialogue changes or doesn't, or what spurs dialogue. And then New Knowledge is doing basically let me say, we're doing a distributed data collecting. We've got 26 zoos and aquariums who are 3 times a year going out and getting us a lot of data so that we're able to get a really good representation across the country of how people are. And then New Knowledge is doing group sourced, a crowdsourced data gathering. Clearly I can't talk, but a crowdsourced data gathering, which is really exciting, where they ask simple little snippet questions and get a lot of people gathering answers to those from a few folks and getting really rich data. So we're not only gathering cool data, we're gathering it in neat ways.
We have about 96 participating institutions that are fielding a survey for us every month. And in that survey, those surveys, they sometimes go to staff, sometimes they're going to friends or family or organizations, sometimes they're intercepting 7 or 8 people. What we're trying to see is if we can gather in an efficient way representative data to tell a deeper story of how people are arriving or leaving with social norms about what the zoo and aquarium does in their world or how it fits in their larger values set. So these are all building again on studies that we've been doing over the last few years. So again, Joe, the work that you were doing on the different modes or identity related motivations that were leading to different learning types and framing the learning. Some of the work that I did a few years ago, looking at a whole family visit by just accompanying a family the whole time. We did some observational studies listening in on conversation that happens when people are looking at animals. And now the team at OSU is able to take their new technologies and find new ways to typify this in a much more deep and engaged way to look at this phenomenon of where does learning occur and what are the provocations. So I think we're kind of adding in sort of classic science, we're getting another millimeter above the last set of studies in order to get more clear and more specific. I think one of the things that I'm enjoying about this project is as far as I can see, this is the first time where we're exploring so deeply both societal and norms and behaviors alongside the intervention that occurs in a visit. It makes the visit experience part of a much larger understanding of the learning world, rather than us focusing on them as if they're in isolation, which has been one of the challenges in the literature.
Okay, thank you guys. So another question from the audience. I know you're still looking through implications of the study, but they were curious on how zoos and aquarium might remarket themselves, quote unquote, to be more recognized as a sort of a place for STEM learning. You probably also have some personal views on this too, but
yeah, it's personal views. I'm going to say I want to wait till we have all the data, because we're at some point going to put all of our pieces together. And that's, I think, the moment when we'll begin to see those kinds of answers. I think if we take any one piece of this study and react to that, because we all are finding out stuff, but I think until we put it together, we really don't have the whole story. And this study is about the whole story, not about any one piece of it. So I want to pull back from jumping ahead too quickly to solutions.
And for those of you that know me on the phone, I'm happy to jump ahead and jump to solutions.
That's true. But don't go there.
I am going to suggest that we've been working closely with the PR and marketing committee at the Association of Zoos and Aquariums so that they can see how these results are triangulating to some of the work they've been doing, both individuals who are doing research on marketing communications, some of the experiments they've been running, and we are trying to see where these things fit together. I think there are a few places we've already developed some recommendations in the peer-reviewed papers that are out for review right now, but this is not how to look at the whole thing. The only thing we're saying is zoos and aquariums are seen as much more robustly represented across the STEM disciplines than their communications would suggest to date. So their public is already telling us that they expect to learn more about the technology and engineering that goes into managing of wildlife than they're seeing in communications. Now, we're not saying that's going to drive attendance. We're not saying anything about that. What we're saying is that there is an appetite in the audience. That's all we can say to date.
And I want to add to that, since the study really looks at where are the opportunities, in part, at least, I mean, I'm focusing now more on the element that my colleagues and I are bringing from OSU. We are asking where are the openings such that we don't shove STEM down people's throats. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we really align what people are bringing and what their interests are. And where are these opportunities to have conversation, education-related conversations that overlap with where the science, the technology, the engineering, and maybe even the math of this lives. And at the end, like Joe was saying, we will probably come out with very rich and provocative and generative ideas about how to embed and infuse STEM into the experience of the visitor without them feeling like they're getting another schooling here. And that's an important component of the whole experience, is to aligning doesn't mean, oh, now we can do more, now we can present ourselves differently. Aligning means, from a pedagogical or andragogical perspective, that we are infusing this in such a way that it remains a visit that people want to have, while at the same time providing the opportunities for deepening experiences that are satisfying and create a lot of positive experiences in the visitor itself.
Now, coming back to the larger project, this is a research to practice project that's funded by the National Science Foundation. We are thrilled they've funded this. There is a practice portion of this. Not only are we developing this, the research in collaboration with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums and all of its committees and committee members. So, you know, as people arrive on this project, they're a little surprised that we have like hundreds of people participating in it, but we do. And that's really exciting. And anybody who's from a zoo or aquarium on this webinar, thank you for everything you've given us and the support you provided. We're partnering with Jessica Sickler Consulting and Cecilia Garibay, and Garibay Group is part of doing the evaluation, and AZA is working with Jessica Sickler Consulting to develop the practice training program. That's in development right now because we don't have answers completely. We've only got some of our preliminary data. Some of the early wave papers are out right now, and so we're anticipating in about 6 months or so they're going to be digging more deeply into the practice training portion of it. Right now, the research to practice is actually practice guiding the research in order for us to be specific, focused, and useful with the research that we're doing.
And we should say we have a great group of advisors from the zoos and aquariums and another group of advisors from a broader informal science learning community who have been really giving us good perspectives and helping shape this project immensely. And if you thought the graphic was instructive, thank the advisors. They really helped us try to explain the complexity of the project simply.
Right.
Or not.
So we have, I would say, about 4 more audience questions. I know you guys actually had some reflection questions for the audience. So we'll spend about 6 or 7 more minutes answering our audience questions and shift gears. So kind of a higher level question. Someone was really interested in this, that all of these kind of commercial centers showed up on where people thought they were learning STEM. And so that seems to indicate some level of importance, particularly in this larger ecosystem. So are there any preliminary implications for how zoos and aquarium might better intentionally partner with some of these places, or other models you've uncovered?
Well, I think zoos and aquariums have done it to some extent, but I think the interesting connection we see with what you can see in your backyard is, I mean, you know, I call it the will do hypothesis because it's like so obvious to make those connections. And I'm really interested to know from the OSU research if we're going to start hearing people drawing those inferences when they see something happening. Quite honestly, we know, and you know, it was like disheartening for all these sign makers that they were so thrilled to make a sign about the most beautiful thing you need to know about African savanna, and you see families looking at it and saying, there's a chickadee. And, you know, so it's kind of, there is that real connection between the outdoors and nature that we think we can bridge, but there is a fine point. I know from a spectacularly unsuccessful example of a zoo that did a what you can see in your backyard, and they had exhibits of all the local native wildlife that were small and brown, and people really just were like, why bother? I can see that in my backyard. So I think there is a logical connection there, but it's not just do what you think. It's not the obvious. It's that it's drawing the connections between those. I think it was why I was so excited to see the auto body shop. I'm not suggesting that auto body shops and libraries are the same, but people seem to think you learn things from both places that are very similar. But it's really, when I think about mechanical engineering, my car is a machine I deal with every day. My refrigerator is too, but it doesn't seem quite as complicated as my car. So I wish I don't have a car. There you go. So auto body shop is great. It doesn't mean they're the same. It just means that there are kinds of learning or learning affordances there that we can explore more deeply.
Right. In the learning sciences, there's a good bit of literature about the everyday learning that we all experience and how that integrates with the other four structures of learning: formal, non-formal, informal, incidental. And so we know that, and what every summary of any study says is the point is to integrate, to draw from people their prior experience, prior knowledge, and help them make connections, that we're not isolated. A zoo or aquarium is not isolated. The visit isn't in isolation. It's a part of the pathway of a person's life. So how are we helping them make those connections from the restaurant to the zoo and aquarium, and from the zoo and aquarium, what could they take to the restaurant, not the animal, but what could they take to the auto body shop, to the backyard?
Right. So it's really like where we're learning on these categorical level. What we know is that people are learning topically, not categorically. And so I think that's part of the story. Though I am reminded of Green Bridges, which is the program managed by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. They have a group of volunteers who basically work to think about the Brooklyn tree canopy at a civic level and at a street level. And that relationship between the volunteers and their learning and what they're sharing with their community is really a bridge where the cultural institution is part of its community and part of its city as a learning organism. And I think what we're trying to show here is that zoos and aquariums participate in the civic learning organism, and that we can tap into that in many ways beyond our borders, rather than necessarily focusing on the visit as where that learning has to occur. So zoos and aquariums could probably start thinking about their social communications and media in relation to others in their set as ways of augmenting learning that extends their brand, their values, and what they bring to the table into the public experience, rather than relying exclusively on the visit experience.
Great, thank you. Quick question, what are the age demographics of your participants in Johnny's?
Okay, slow answer. 18 we don't stratify, but we were getting a representative sample, so we're doing age, region, and then we try to oversample for minority representation, so we can dig a little bit deeper into smaller populations in order to know if the findings are generalizable or if there are distinct categories that are distinct narratives that emerge from different subsets in our population. Generally, we're not finding anything based on sex, but we try to stratify our sample that way, even though we're doing a representative sampling. It's just to make sure we've got enough in a cell to triangulate against some of the demographics or psychographics. Oh, and in our sample, I'm going to say specifically, we did two things that were unique in that we know there are two stable populations in the United States, one very large segment that just thinks zoos and aquariums can do no wrong, and another one that thinks zoos and aquariums are vilified and can do no right. And we felt that that was not really useful because they they have already declared a clear bias. And so we went right down the middle and pulled out those because we know that the answers we get from them, even in our early pilot studies, are going to be just max out the answers on either end of the scale. So we wanted to look at where the variation is in society. And so that's really affecting about, 55–60% of the population is in our sample, and then the 7% at the bottom end and the 20% at the top end we did not use for this study in order to for this study we included some of it, but mostly we're excluding them because we're looking at this group where trust is contingent.
And in our sample, for instance, where we put people in groups, one person carries the GoPro camera with them. We made sure it's a more typical sample, making sure we don't miss out on particular groups because it's difficult to reach them and have them engaged. But we also made sure that we actually have a recording during the time when we were sampling of every visitor who came at that time to the institution, so we can find the bias in our data. And that's primarily what we want to do. So it can never be perfect, but you need to know where you have to have some critical questions around what your sample looks like and what might be missing, who might be missing. We feel really good about the representation of our sample in the sense of being typical. So in that sense, we did take great care, just like Johnny was explaining for the national samples, that what we find has somewhat good representation that we can generalize as best we can.
All right, thank you. We do still have several other kind of specific questions about methodology and the study itself. So if you ask a question and we didn't answer it, we will follow up with you afterwards and have either some of the project staff or co-PIs and PIs get that answered for you. So now I think our presenters have some questions they'd like to ask of the audience.
And while you're taking time to think on these, we are doing a second webinar, and any of the questions that we can include as full responses in the next webinar, we're happy to do that. So anything you're giving us right now, we also want to fold into shaping the next webinar that we're doing. So anything coming up?
Give them time, give them time.
Yeah, you just want to talk, say the questions and verbally.
Yeah, you've got a better voice anyway.
So just to say, so the two reflection questions basically have to do with what somebody asked right from the beginning, which is the first one is very concrete. What institutional agendas are you pursuing that might not be high on your visitors' mind? So it's the same thing, the equivalent of conservation is an issue for zoos and aquariums. I try to see what the visitors do with that. You may have other things that are important to you. And then there's, of course, the bigger question that somebody asked right from the beginning: what is the implication of this work for different settings that are, particularly that are not zoos and aquariums? And for us, hearing from you is important because it helps us position this work and taking this into account already in this research to practice partnership. The more we hear from people elsewhere about how this study resonates with them, the more we can be of help.
Okay. So we have just a couple minutes left. Whatever your answer is comes to mind quickly, feel free to add it in the question pod. Otherwise, we will be sending out a survey along with the webinar recording and slides, probably Monday or Tuesday. And again, I think panelists and presenters would love to hear your thoughts on that, and we'll definitely keep that in mind for part 2. So let's switch to the next slide. I think we can talk a little bit about what we'll hear in that.
Yeah, so this overview was a taste of our early work on this complex and really exciting project. For the next webinar, we want to share a cursory overview, a cursory introduction to some of the preliminary findings from WZAM 3. You got a taste of it today with one of many of Johnny's studies, and at the next webinar, we'll give you a taste of several of the different pieces. And we look forward to sharing with you some of the potentially valuable learnings that the collaboration is seeking to gain. So thank you for being here and for your attention, and stay tuned for details coming soon.